On 22 May 2003, the United Nations Security Council announced the last resolution 1483, formally ending the section that was on Iran, and which dominated the debate about the comprehensive sanction against Iran. Here, the effectiveness of economic sanctions, about their humanitarian impact, and about their legitimacy, morality of these weapons. The idea here of this introduction, rather than using the force or rather than using the physical power, they use another kind of punishment, which is economic sanctions. Economic sanctions have long been the core of international relations. The phase documented incidents of sanctions for political date of Eastern Greece at the time of the scandal or Great Scandal 432 BC, which banned all trade between Megara or Megarian Empire against Venetian Empire. Throughout the history from the ancient Greece to 19th century, the 10 economic sanctions foreshadowed work for the work there. So the idea of economic sanctions might be related to the use of force, only receive attention after the First World War, largely owing to the President Woodrow Wilson advocacy. This means before the First World War that there was no attention about economic sanctions. But subsequently, the economic sanctions were incorporated as an enforcement tool in each of the two security systems established in the 20th century, the League of Nations and the United Nations. So after the First and Second World War, there were many legislations and laws about the laws of the wars. One of these was economic sanctions, and there was no intention about it till the President Woodrow Wilson advocacy and gives attention to this kind of new punishment. So the economic sanctions imposed by the League of Nations firstly succeeded in small easing, but they failed miserably in the one big case. And for instance about this, the general meaning of this one, the economic sanction in the earlier times was succeeding about small issues or small cases. But when it comes to bigger one, it failed, especially the attempt to drive Italy out of Ethiopia in 1935. And just kind of notice this not meaning this kind of sanction it out of work. It workable, but in this case it failed. So here we have use and effectiveness in the 20th century. Trends in the use of sanctions. Economic sanctions are deliberate government-inspired withdrawal or threat withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations with the target country in effort to change the country policies. So rather than using the force or power, we use many kinds, such as government-inspired withdrawal to threat of withdrawal, kind of cutting off the economic relationship between the two countries. The powerful country will make many kind of punishments against the other country or the country out of law. While economic sanctions have preceded war for most of the modern history, the motives behind use of economic sanctions have changed since the First World War. Economic sanctions were primarily used to reduce the target capabilities, and in the modern times, the motives shifted to changing a target state's behavior and deterring others, or simply sending a message of disapproval in response to objectionable behavior. So the general idea of all this introduction or this mentioning, rather than using force or rather than using nuclear weapon or physical weapon, or even any kind of punishment, there is many kinds of new punishment, such as in response to simply sending a message to disapprove a response or to change the behavior of the state. We can give example about recently the war between United States and China. United States gives China many kinds of punishments to change the behavior of China, the social behavior of the states, to get back to its policy or the way it works. The US remains the most frequent user of economic sanction in absolute terms. The frequency of new unilateral US initiatives declined in the 90s. Some high-profile unilateral ventures, such as Cuba, were inherited from previous decades. But the vast majority of US sanctions in the 90s were undertaken in conjunction with other senders. By the contrast, in the 70s, US was involved in 31 sanctions episodes and 3/4 of them unilateral initiatives. So, and still, the major power or the main power in the world, US was and still the most using of this kind of sanction because it is the most powerful country in the recent world. One factor in decline of US unilateral advances was collapse of Soviet Union. At the end of soft power rivalry allowed for much greater cooperation of major powers and the United Nations framework. The main reason that the decline of advances or decline of initiatives, or in other meaning, the punishment of the cases that have been taken by the United States, it has been declined because of the collapse of Soviet Union, and there was no any other rival measure against the United States of America, and all the countries that they were belonging to Soviet group. Most of them, they have become another part of United Nations framework. Meanwhile, the theater of action have little or even no concern on China, Russia, permanent members of Security Council. This is by another meaning, it's showing the bias from the Western countries against the Eastern countries. So, in the case of China and the case of Russia, there was no any kind of punishment at that time because they were permanent members of the Security Council. But on the other hand, the UN arms embargoes imposed against Rwanda in 1994 and against Ethiopia and Unity in 2000. These 2 points illustrating the policies or the way of using the actions against to say, the weak countries rather than powerful countries. In the case of China and Russia, there was no any kind of punishment or sanctions. But in the case of Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Unity, there were many punishment and economic sanctions to illustrate the points of the bias with against or with the powerful countries. There were many sanctions between 70s, 80s, after the Cold War from the Western countries against Soviet bloc. And Russia itself imposed many sanctions against the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. After the declaration of the President Woodrow, the new kind of punishment of the new kind of economic sanctions have been occupying the area times of war or Cold War. Here we have example, Russia itself, after the falling or after the collapse of Soviet bloc, it made many kind of sanctions against the new independent states. They were states from the Soviet bloc or Eastern bloc. The EU as well has become a much more active user of economic sanctions over the last decade. Even the European Union as well made the same. Effectiveness of foreign policy sanctions. The use of sanctions was relatively wide in 50s, 60s, and 70s, but the proliferation of the sanctions in the late 80s, 90s, in particular UN against Iraq, generated intense debate among policymakers, corporations, and scholars. After the declaration of the new kind of punishment, which is economic sanctions, the phase beginning at 50s, 60s, 70s, they were very wide. But later on, there was many kind of economic sanctions, particularly in Iraq, which was against Saddam and his war against Kuwait. Economic sanctions from 1919 to 2000s have been achieving a steady decline. Between 1945 to 1969, sanctions contributed to a positive policy outcome in 43% of cases studied, and by 19th had dropped to 35%. This showing the steady decline from 43% to 35% of applying this kind of sanctions. So, cost of economic sanctions. We have two kinds of costs. Cost against the sender country and cost against the target countries. So firstly, we have cost of the sender country. Why the success of a sanction is often elusive? The cost of sanctions to the sender country are not. The intent of trade sanctions is to reduce trade, pause exports and imports. Financial sanctions and asset freezes also reduce trade. Empirical study by the Institute for International Economics, IIE, measured the impacts of economic sanctions on bilateral emissions, trade flows. The study found that extensive sanctions have a large depressing effect on trade. So the phase effective against the sender country, the post countries, which was the sender or the target, they have been facing many kind of depressing trade when they use this kind of new punishment or economic sanctions. Cost to the target country, the second one, the economic sanctions on the target country is determined by the severity of sanctions and extent to the target country's trade and investment links with the sender country. This means cutting off all the relations between the sender country and the target country in a view of trading relations. Research by Institute for International Economics indicates that sanctions tend to be more effective as diplomatic weapon against friends than foes. Even this new kind of sanctions could be used against even friends without showing any kind of harmful intentions. Countries with the substantial trade and close political ties with the sender are thus more vulnerable to the actions. Even in the case of UK, for instance, was unenthusiastic to impose sanctions against Southern Rhodesia or recently South Africa or Zimbabwe. Russia was never lukewarm about participating in the sanctions against Syria. And even China has never imposed sanctions on Pakistan or North Korea. This is statistics showing that the country are unwilling to take any kind of this EU sanction because it affects both sides, the center and the target country. Can't sanctions be made smarter? Targeted sanctions or smart sanctions like smartphones, for example, are meant to focus their questions while sparing powerless civilians. Growing emphasis to the individual accountabilities of those in power for unlawful acts of states had made the concept of targeted sanctions all more attractive. Rockers of arms embargoes and drug bans. This is about weapons and about banning of any kind of traveling from the terrorists or the targeted person or entities. Arms embargoes help to identify and stigmatize those who violate international norms. Travel or aviation bans can be divided into two categories. Firstly, restrictions on all air travel to and from the target Kenya. Secondly, restriction on the travel of target individual groups and entities. So we have an example here for what we have mentioned. An interesting case study of smart sanction that contributed to a successful policy outcome was European Union blacklist. In EU, we have kind of blacklist against the people who made any harmful against the international law or international relations. This is called the blacklist. One of the blacklist of EU was the president of Serbia, Milosevic, by freezing all his abroad accounts and all his money outside of Serbia. And after so, his regime was breaking down. This is just an example for motivation. Financial sanctions. Financial sanctions such as asset freezes, limiting access to the financial markets, or restricting economic assistance have received a considerable attention from practitioners and scholars. In the last few years, the Swiss government has led to an international effort to complexities associated with the asset freezes and other financial sanctions. So here we have the big example about these new policies. Following the attack of 9/11/2001, law enforcement focused sharply on financial trade of terrorist networks. Existing legislations that prohibited financial transaction with terrorist organizations and especially designated terrorism was broadened the class of the targeted groups and provide authority to block U.S. assets and deny access to U.S. markets to foreign banks refusing to cooperate with U.S. investigations. This is the new policy of the U.S. against the candidates that refusing or rejecting to apply the new kind of new rules from the U.S. against the world or against other candidates. So if the country deals with the U.S. to make the U.S. make investigations with the country, this will be kind of new cooperation between U.S. and that country. But if the country refused to make any kind of new relationship between U.S. and another country, this means this country belongs to the terrorist or the terrorist band. So here you have the conclusion. Targeted sanctions operate on a level of interventions and discriminations in the internal affairs of states was unknown in previous decades. This kind of new attack or sharing was unknown. Their effective implementation requires the tremendous amount of detailed knowledge about country, person, and group targeted. Even after the process of defining the secrecy and the speed of critical to preventing the target from move assets to numbered account in offshore centers. So even after the process of identification, there is a kind of secrecy and speed, and also it has been hunted or it's been hunted by the U.S. and the Western countries especially to target any kind of new asset to especially on number accounts, which is already been declared as blacklist accounts in a sure sentence. That's it.